Welcome to Sculpture Vulture. I'm Lucy Branch, a sculptural conservator and author, bringing you a series of interviews with some amazing sculptors who inspire me, and I hope will do the same for you. You can see the photographs accompanying the interview, the episode show notes, and get a free novel from sculpturevulture.co.uk. Hello everyone, I'm thrilled to be talking to Hazel Reeves today. She produces some of my favourite types of sculpture, big, bronze and found in the hurly-burly of city streets. In recent years, she's secured several prestigious commissions, among them the Sir Nigel Gresley sculpture in King's Cross in London, commemorating the engineer and innovator of steam trains, and the Cracker Packer statue dedicated to the women who have worked in the Cars biscuit factory, now McVitie's in Carlisle, for over 100 years. I've been so keen to talk to Hazel ever since I was involved in doing some preventive conservation work for her on her incredible sculpture of Emmeline Pankhurst, our Emmeline in the centre of Manchester. Today, I thought I'd kick off our chat by asking her when she first felt drawn to creating sculpture.
Well, I think you have to go back to when I was younger and I was desperate to go to art school, and my parents said no. And so I sort of forgot about that artistic career for many years. And then I was in the Dominican Republic working with the UN on women's rights. And I suddenly got back in touch with all the things I was passionate about. So music, drumming, dancing, art. And when I came home, it was just sort of came to me that I was going to be a portrait sculptor, which was quite bizarre because I'd never actually done any sculpting nor any portraits. But it's the only time in my life I've actually suddenly realised I had a calling.
And so is that because your parents thought that they just didn't have anything to do with the arts, and so it was very alien to them that they discouraged it? Or was it that it wasn't a proper job?
Oh, all of the above. According to my mum, art is a luxury. And you only did art if you couldn't do anything else. My elder sister was already at art school, and I think they also were worried about having two penniless artists in the family. So it was like, no, you're more academic. You can go off and go to college. And yeah, so it was many years later that actually I rediscovered that this is what I should always have been doing. But this is my journey, and I wouldn't be the sculptor I am now if I hadn't been on that journey.
Wow. And so it's definitely was something that kind of came to you'd sort of squashed down for quite a long time. I wonder what it was about the Dominican Republic that brought it all to the front of the forefront of your mind. So is it the environment there?
It's a very creative place. I really got into the Afro-Dominican folkloric scene there. And that's very much about the music and the dance, and involved in that. But it's also a very vibrant place, a very creative place, a very musical place. And also you're completely out of your normal environment. So making that transition from the UK to this sort of country of, deep poverty in some places, but also working with the UN was a tremendous experience. But it was particularly the nightlife and the nights out dancing that just really sort of shook my whole system up. And it was like, I'm actually not somebody to be sitting at a desk.
Yeah, and how long had you been sort of on this other career path for?
Well, I had several career paths, but the latter career, for brief time reasons, I was really passionate about women's rights, and I went and did a master's at LSE and ended up running a research and communications program on women's rights, promoting women's rights internationally. And so I've been doing that for a number of years, and as part of that I had a sabbatical out in the Dominican Republic. And so I carried on with that career because I'm completely committed to promoting gender equality and social justice. So I was able to bring, I guess, both my passions together, and I was learning how to sculpt alongside going to these ministerial meetings, across the world.
So that was what I was going to ask. I was going to say, apart from the concept of sculpture and the angles of it, there's also a huge dexterity and practical wisdom that your hands and your brain to hands need to go through, because it really is such a technical thing, and especially the way you sculpt. You can see that it's very, very carefully placed when the surfaces and things like that. So I just wondered when you had time to sort of get that technical, all those hours, those 10,000 hours or more that we've all got to do to become a master at something.
I mean, it took a couple of years after my sort of realization that this was what I was going to be, and I got on a course at Sussex University on their continuing education program with Sylvia McRae Brown, and I started that evening class, and then it became a day class, and then it became compressing my working week into 4 days so I could go and spend a day up in London, and then it became summer schools, and then finally a month in Florence. So it became an extreme hobby. And then when there's a point when it was like, actually, this is what I really ought to be doing. And the joy of doing a commission like the Emmeline Pankhurst was I could actually bring these passions together. So the passion for women's rights and challenging inequality, and my love and passion for figurative sculpture. So you imagine that was an amazing gig for me.
Absolutely. And what a fantastic sculpture. I just love her. I just love her, honestly. She is magnificent, and obviously that's where you and I kind of came across each other. So I think she's going to definitely be in my heart for a very long time, because I think we've got quite a lot of things in common, really. I always felt that this sort of lack of female in public sculpture is always such a shame, because it's not, I don't think it has been an intentional thing necessarily. It's just a reflection of history and the kind of monuments that were being produced. But there is so many times where I just feel like there's an emptiness of female characters, and seeing what you've done with Emmeline and with your other sculptures is something we need a lot more of, if we possibly can. So get working, work harder.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, when you look at the figures, I think it was the PMSA figures and Caroline Criado Perez worked out there's only 2.7% of statues were actually of historical non-royal women. I mean, 2.7%. So I can be very proud that I've added sort of 3 sculptures of women since then, and there has been a number of other ones. But it's interesting to think about, as you say, sort of why it is there's such a lack of representation of women. And actually, I think I've got a slightly stronger take on that, because I think it's ultimately down to the lack of recognition of women's achievements and the lack of recognition of women more broadly. So in effect, it's very much discrimination. And I think, it's also about who makes the decisions over time, and who is deemed worthy of capturing in bronze. And inevitably it's men, and it's all about sort of power and money. So we're definitely overdue for more statues of women. It's not the only way to redress the lack of representation of women in society, but it's my entry point. It's one entry point. I think it is an important one.
You see, a lot of conservation begins with historic research. If we don't have an artist alive who we can speak to face to face, we are hitting obviously published material but also unpublished. So quite often we are in National Archives searching up anything that might have relevance. And what I found so often is fantastic correspondence that was involved in the creation of these monuments. And very often the correspondence is by women. and they are pushing for these features to be made, these sculptures to be made. Maybe they are of their husbands, maybe they've had some other connection to the thing. But the thing that's really sad is that often that you come across this other aspect of it, which is documents which are kind of saying, oh, these silly women that want to have these sculptures placed in such and such. And so even their opinion, and obviously it's their energy that actually did a lot to bring those statues into those locations, and actually they're being dismissed, and they're not published, these things. So again, it's that missing link that actually there were women involved in the creation of these things as well, and their opinions were dismissed very often, and so things were not put in the places that they were supposed to, or that they were or the money wasn't raised in the way that they'd hoped. But they were a big part of the creation of these monuments as well, and that's not acknowledged either.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds fascinating. You must write a book on this, you know.
And I know I've kind of got the secrets behind statues kind of book in my head at some point, but along with many other ideas.
I mean, I think what is interesting now is that there are a number of groups of women across the country that are rallying together and trying to redress this lack of women in statuary. And I think that's really interesting. And I think the real issue is around the will, but it's the funding. And I think possibly at the moment with the COVID crisis, we've got very serious dangers of actually pushing back women's role in public life to a certain extent. And the arts funding has completely pretty much collapsed at the moment for obvious reasons. And these projects are reliant on often not government or council funding. They're reliant on you and me giving money and support them. So a bit like the subscription system in Victorian times, you know, give a penny to, you know, fund this statue. But people are going to be going through some pretty tough economic times. So it does worry me that that might have an impact on how many sculptors there are and what proportion of those are women. We don't revert back to a very few sculptures being made over the next 10 years and then primarily being of men. So I think that's something to watch out for.
Sure. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was that I totally love your tagline on your website. I think I might have to pinch it actually, because it's telling stories with bronze. And obviously I enjoy writing novels and they're all about bronze, but I wondered what it was particularly that drew you towards bronze, why it's your thing in particular.
I think I wasn't aware of it until I had my first commission, and it was somebody from one of my classes that was a fellow student, and they obviously could see something in what I was doing in terms of doing portraits, and so I sculpted him, and then he paid for it to be cast in bronze. So that's when my love of bronze and the process, that's when it was sort of really kicked off. My love affair, I suppose you could call it, which is that sometimes it's tempestuous, but on the whole, you know, it's a pretty good relationship. And I think, first of all, yes, bronze, it's practical, it's durable, it's robust. I mean, as a sculptor working in the public realm, you need all those things. So that is fundamental. But I think my main reasons for working in bronze are sort of artistic reasons. So it's a material that can take what I've spent months working on in the studio. It can take my very fingerprints, all my marks, all my movement of the clay. It can reproduce that into bronze perfectly. So that's really important for me, that sort of transferred across the process, which is quite an invasive process in many ways. And there's nothing quite like the feel of bronze, is there? And the weight of bronze, you know, touching it is wonderful. And the colours that can come out through the patination process are quite extraordinary. I mean, it is a very variable and difficult process to get right, but that's why it is so amazing, I think. And I think bronze enables me to tell stories it enabled me to do something quite extraordinary, which was to position an over life-size woman on top of a domestic kitchen chair in public in the middle of St. Peter's Square in Manchester. I mean, that's rather unusual thing to do.
Yeah.
But the properties of bronze enabled me to tell that story, because I wanted to show how in the times of the suffragettes, they'd be out on the streets ringing bells, summoning people from their homes to listen to their speeches. Somebody would grab a kitchen chair, and Emmeline, who was only 5 foot tall, would be elevated above the crowds to urge them to rise up and demand the vote. So bronze and its strength enabled me to actually tell that story, which I think was quite important. And I do work with dancers, being a lifelong dance lover, and bronze can enable me to capture a real gravity defying pose mid-air, which would be impossible for the poor model to hold for very long. And you can really exude the joy of dance by playing with the balance and playing with it, and that's only possible really with bronze. And I think,
did you try any other materials? Did you work with any others?
I've tried plaster, but that doesn't have the robustness that I need for things like, you know, a gravity-defying pose. There's really no alternative material. I don't carve. Stone isn't an option. Bronze resin, which some people use, or cold cast bronze, as they sometimes call it, that's not robust at all. I've used that, and it's fine for maybe a portrait, quite a simple form, but anything that's delicate or involves movement of weight, shifting of weight, just doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean the suffragette scroll, which is towards Victoria in London, so just down from Parliament Square towards Victoria, that's been in place. It's not one of the only monuments to the suffragettes in London for many, many years. That's made from cold cast bronze. In the old days, a poor man's bronze, and I did speak to the estate to have, unfortunately, the sculptor had dementia at the time, but his wife was saying to me, we couldn't even raise the funds for bronze because even though it was such an important monument at the time, there was no money for female-based history sort of monument, and so cold cast was all we could afford. And it's an ongoing effort to try and conserve that because it has a rippled scroll effect, and the edges are continuously, they're so fragile, they're just breaking open all the time. Environment really, but also the strain and just the amount of water that then soaks into the interior of it and affects the more of the seams. So it's a wonder that it has lived as long as it's lived, because you wouldn't actually know unless you came up and stroked it that it isn't a real bronze. It really is very, very good, well made. It's just that, you know, it can't be here forever because it's just not robust enough.
Oh, it would be, yes. I mean, it makes you think that wouldn't it be wonderful for that to go into a museum and have a bronze replacement out in the, so that you know that will be there for posterity, because that's.
Yeah. I know it's one that I kind of always hope that's one of the incredible female leaders who break the glass ceilings will go and sort of decide that they will patronise it as a kind of
Yes.
a monument to women taking that forward. But it isn't a huge bronze actually, but it wouldn't be a huge bronze, but it's kind of a special thing. Now, I think what you were mentioning as well about the engineering of bronze, what it enables you to do, is that's what you really see when you move into like looking at Renaissance bronzes, is that suddenly you're able to get groups in doing the most incredibly energetic poses, as opposed to previously when you look at classical times where they had zillions of very large scale bronzes. It's incredible they had the technology to make those, the numbers and the size of bronzes in sort of classical times, but they were all individually posed and quite static. and it's just that suddenly when you hit Renaissance times, you really see a change, and it's because of the engineering, what was really they were realizing could be done, and experimenting, and all those amazing foundries that it's the time I dream about being able to go back to. If I could ever time travel, I want to go to a foundry in Florence during the Renaissance times and learn. That's what I want to do.
Oh wow, that would be amazing, wouldn't it?
But no, that incredible capacity, you really begin to see that so early on, and you realise that actually we haven't had that technology for that long in this country. Our earliest large-scale bronze is hundreds of years later, and just how incredibly advanced they were with the technology and what they could do. So have you had any problems with bronze? Have you had any conservation issues that have come up in any of your statues? Maybe during the making or something?
I think both sculpting and the bronze casting process are basically problem-solving processes. So you're at every stage, there are likely to be problems. And so you're always asking the question, how can I get this close to where it needs to be? So artistically, or in terms of how can I make sure this wax is faithful to my original clay, or how can I get this patination to work? And I think it's about a close relationship with foundry, and I work with Bronze Age sculpture casting foundry because they're figurative special, and we have a very close relationship to solve the problems as we go along, so there aren't any nasty surprises. We've worked out a plan how to sort it out, and I do feel the tension until it's actually winched into place. I do feel that tension, that it's my responsibility to get it from as faithful as possible from my clay right through to the final product. But I know, and I have the confidence of working with their skilled people in the foundry, that through their skills in mold making, wax working, casing, in metalwork, in patination, I know that we will get there, and it's that confidence that I know we'll get there. So I think they're very patient with me, actually. They never actually say it, but that I know them completely. But I do tend to be quite finicky.
Yeah, you get the allowed to do that because you created her.
Exactly, I got an investment in it, and I think that's what's lovely is the feedback you can get from the people in the foundry who that genuinely want to get it and to meet your vision, and on sort of a joint journey together to sort of make this thing happen. So they tolerate me.
Sure they don't. Sure they're thrilled.
Interfering.
But I mean, sometimes it's very often a case as well of bronze being able to be put into a position, especially in the public realm, and seeing how they settle down, because there are so many different aspects that can affect a bronze, which you can't predict because you don't know how the public are going to appreciate that sculpture. And when I say appreciate, sometimes it's not always appreciation. Sometimes it's a little bit more lewd than that. Unfortunately, you get some statues, I don't know why, but they are particularly portable loos. It seems to be a beacon for people coming out of the pubs, and particularly have a name for that. And then you have others which are like Emmeline, who actually, when I'd been there after a whole year, she had hardly any damage on her at all, and that is astonishing to me, because usually you would get, I don't know, people who are hanging around and leaning up against a statue and rubbing away the patina unintentionally, or scraping it with their bag because they've got a buckle on the back of the bag and they didn't realise, or they've got people who are thinking that there might be a message to be put up on the media if they tag it with something, that their name might be got out on social media or something. And actually with Emmeline, I really saw nothing of that, a constant adoration from her public who came to talk to me while I was working.
Like, what are you doing?
What are you doing? Yeah, absolutely. And sure, that's I'm so glad. You need people who are asking questions. It's people who just let people get on with things that actually, that's when a lot of damage can get done. People do all sorts of graffiti and people think, oh, they should be there. I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah.
But actually, a lot of things are very hard to predict until they're in position. So you just can't know what damage might be part of their everyday life until they're there.
I think there's something about ownership, sort of community ownership of sculptures, that I think makes a difference. And I think with Emmeline, there was engagement with the public from the start, from the very first question, which was, why are there no sculptures of women apart from Queen Victoria in Manchester, to, okay, here's a short list of all these amazing Mancunian women. Who do you want to vote for? Who do you want the sculpture to be of? And they chose Emmeline, of course. So from the very early stages, even before I got involved, the local communities were involved, and lots of the women's rights charities have been involved throughout. And I've worked with some of them, and it's been a wonderful process to engage with everyone. And the unveiling was, the most tremendous experience. 6,000 people on the streets in St. Peter's Square. We had 1,000 young kids. The noise was incredible. And I was leading the march into town with Helen Pankhurst, the great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst. And we were meant to be leading the children. But of course, within moments, they were surging ahead of us, and we were getting left behind with their enthusiasm, sort of shouting out,
brilliant.
What do we want? Equality. When do you want it? Now. And it was so heartwarming to see these kids so engaged. They'd made up their banners, and walking into St. Peter's Square to meet the throngs there was just an amazing experience. And I don't say that's not me, but I guess it's what if you'd asked me what my ideal might have been when I first started the process, would be a statue that people engaged with. I couldn't foresee what the unveiling would be like, and how hopefully this statue is a catalyst ongoing, and that's what I'm hopeful for. And
but actually, we've got very few things that we can do preventive conservation wise with outdoor sculpture. It's not in a museum. You can regulate the environment really quite specifically to make sure that there is minimal change to that sculpture in that environment. But outdoors, we have a very narrow treatment ability to keep it as little change as possible. But actually, what you've just talked about there is an incredible preventive conservation strategy, which is begin by engaging people that will appreciate and look after that statue and treat it well and become champions of that statue. And that is just as useful to that object as making sure you've got low humidity in an environment at a gallery. So I think that should be part of the plan of all the sculptures.
Yes, what's been really interesting is that something that probably conservators like yourself would be horrified by, but for example, across the 16 days of activism against violence against women, which is sort of an international programme in November each year, Manchester charities dressed up Emmeline each day differently. And so they're trying to get across the message that employers need to keep an eye out for any of their staff that they feel might be experienced domestic abuse, and getting them to sign up for a pledge to actually do something about it, and be helped with sort of training on what support they can give. So Emmeline was dressed up as a doctor, a nurse. She was dressed up as, you name it, a teacher, all sorts of people, but done in a very careful and sensitive way. So there was no use of wire. They'd already thought about and talked to me about beforehand how they're going to be very careful not to harm her in any way. Brilliant. So the outcome of getting that and raising awareness of violence against women was a really important role for that statue. And in more recent times, she's been seen wearing face masks, for example, in our COVID
yes.
times.
Yes.
She's been used for arguments around the need to tackle climate justice as well. She was wearing inflatable vests, and sort of questions about what happens when the sea levels rise to here. So actually, I think that's the biggest compliment I can get, really, as a sculptor, for one of my pieces of work to be used as a political tool.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect.
And not harmed in any way.
But great that they're engaging with you about it. That's the thing, is that when people actually talk to those involved who can make sure that they can manifest their ideas but safely and not without a big consequence to the sculpture, it's totally doable with public art, really, especially bronze, because it is, if you understand it, it is doable and it can be managed, definitely. So I've been reading your Nightingale diaries, which you've been enjoying. And I know that you are very involved, very inspired by birdsong right now. And I hope that you might be able to share a little bit about what fuels and strengthens your creative practice. I know that you've mentioned dance, but have you got a creative practice? That's a good question.
Well, I think initially I just saw myself as a sculptor, and I just do clay sculpting for bronze, and that was my creative practice. And I think over time, because I've been so caught up with big commissions, I think over time I've realised actually there's much more that I want to say, and politics is usually at the lowest level or a more obvious level, but I see myself now, I think, as an artist, and sometimes I use sculpture, sometimes I might use birdsong and audio, soundscapes. So that's really exciting. I think I see sculpting in the more traditional form as quite visceral. And so I've always wanted to use this to affect people in some way, whether it's to bring a smile to their face, affect them in other ways, like, a call to action. I want them to affect people. And so this is where it comes into the storytelling. But I think I'm actually choreographing stories. So I'm choreographing and telling stories, and I want to tell these untold stories. So that's, I suppose, is my artistic practice. But as it goes forward, then I'm much less wedded to only using materials that have a very physical presence. I love the idea of using more ephemeral materials. So there's one project I've been working on for the last 6 months, which is a sculptor using a group of dancers as her dynamic material, and actually manipulating these dancers using audio soundscapes.
Okay, so kind of performance art.
So it's performance, but it's bringing a sculptural perspective to it, because I want to know what it looks like. I also want it, as a dancer, I always want to know what it feels like as well. So I've got this the view as a sculptor, but also this visceralness that is at the heart of my practice. Is I want to feel it as well as see it.
So when I kind of talked about practice, I was kind of thinking about how some people wake up in the morning and they meditate before beginning their day, or they journal or something. So you don't jump out of bed and dance. I'm kind of trying to envision the sort of, or maybe you sculpt, but something different than what you're actually working on, because no matter how much we love our creations, when it's a commission, it's work as well as a pleasure. Is there that other side to it where you're feeding that creative flow?
That's interesting. So I don't have one of these sort of, I go into the studio and do a drawing every morning or anything like that. I come to realize that actually my life is my artistic practice. So I spend a lot of time actually in nature. My studio's in the heart of the countryside. So actually walking out is where I get a lot of ideas for doing other types of work. And as you say, I love birdsong. My mum ran a bird hospital and sanctuary for many years.
Fantastic.
So that was what I knew, I guess. And it's only now I sort of perhaps recognizing that that's where my obsession with recording birdsong actually comes comes from, and be able to use this in my sort of sculptural work by manipulating dancers, So so I don't have a particular practice.
I went to a conference fairly recently, which was about conservation of contemporary sculpture and other art, and they had a whole section on how to conserve performance art, which it blew my mind, because I was thinking, how on earth, I've never even considered what might go into conserving that. And it was about exactly what you're talking about, which is the ideas of the artist and how they can very easily, without them being documented, how they can be lost, because it's not just about the movement, and it's actually an interpretation. And it was fascinating, but completely, it was completely sort of mind-blowing and boggling.
I think it is. I think for me it's very interesting to think about how this dance project, for example, is something which is ephemeral, but the joy of actually working with other artists. So I'm working with a filmmaker, I'm working with a sound artist, I'm working with dancers, and other artists like a photographer and somebody who's a performance drawer. So they're all going to help me document it as part of the artistic process. So that will be interesting, because I haven't worked in film. Doing soundscapes is new to me, so this is all exciting stuff.
Well, I think that this is not my field, but you need a conservator as well at this stage the concept is that obviously to be able to reproduce these things in years into the future, where understanding of what's going on now is not there. And it was very, very subtle, but I think you definitely need a conservator involved.
And actually I was listening to an interview with one of the former archivist at the British Library who covers audio, and it's fascinating about, they've got some amazing audio speeches, all types of things, but there's very few machines across the world that can still play some of these things, and they need to play them in order to digitize them, and I hadn't really even thought about that.
And one of our main sources actually for understanding original patterns that we use is audio. So for example, most of the photographs are black and white when you go back in time, and we're trying to look at what the original patinator finish. It wasn't necessarily just a brown bronze or dark brown bronze. There was nuance, and it's in these audio documents that we often have the most fantastic revelations, because you listen and the descriptions are so brilliantly done, and no one's written them down in the newspapers. It's all on audio, and people just making comments when they've been interviewed about it and things like this. Fantastic source of material. Absolutely, but I'll be horrified if they can't digitize it all. What will we do?
Oh yes, that would be. I must say, I'm just so delighted and honoured that you and Antique Bronze are the ones that are looking after my Emmeline. It makes such a difference to know that a statue is being looked after, being maintained across the years, and I wish more of my clients did the same and brought you in.
Well, the thing is that it's one of those things that I don't really mind if it's not me even. I just want things to be, if preventive is much better than having to start restoring things, because there's nothing like the beauty of bronze when it can be brought along carefully and managed. You just can't add the extra part that time adds to something if it's been well looked after. I think that there's such beauty in that, and it's just such a shame to lose it. And so these sort of spiky, something's looked up, restored, and then left for 50 years and then restored again. It's not a good way about it, and it's not necessary either. So I sort of spend a lot of time trying to get people to just think about the long term. Once it's there, don't just think about getting it there. What happens afterwards? I don't know, hopefully it's something that people get more sort of, it becomes part of the psyche of creating lovely monuments in the future. Maybe people will think more forward.
Yeah, and I think give the dues the Emmeline Pankhurst project. They've built in terms of when they got their funding in, and a lot of government funding came in, they allocated a large lump of money to pass over to Manchester City Council so they could afford to maintain Emmeline across the years. And I think that's very sort of forward thinking.
Very well thought through, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's just finish up by telling me if you have anything, what's on at the moment? Have you got anything exciting in the studio?
Oh, well, there's always projects in the studio. So the moment with the bigger projects, they're sort of waiting for funding, which has all been a bit stalled at the moment. So there's projects I have been working on, various different portraits, and I've got some plaster work I've got to be working on, some heads and figures, which is quite fun to do. And I'm working in wax and doing some experimentations with dancing figures to show the agony and the ecstasy of dance, which I'm looking forward to doing. I've done some work at Bronze Age on the waxes there, and I've been playing with mud as well. So that's been very interesting. So using mud as a sculpting material.
Very good.
And it's not because I haven't got any clay. I have got plenty of clay.
The COVID situation has made us all have to be very creative in our thinking, but mud, wow.
Yeah, so sort of playing with mud and then going out recording the Nightingales is sort of, my idea of the perfect day.
Well, that's a creative practice in itself, isn't it? Mud play.
It is.
And have you had good results with it?
What's interesting is because it's experimental. I'm documenting and photographing what happens with what I'm doing. So it's a combination of working with the mud in a more sort of formal sculptural process, see how that works. And that's been interesting. The first one I did collapsed within 10 minutes, which is what I sort of thought it probably would do.
Is that mud from your garden, or is this special mud?
This is special mud. This is from the land surrounding my studio. So I've been permissioned to dig up different sections, and with the idea of actually returning sculptures to that place by the lake, in the meanders, and documenting what happens. Because I love this sort of idea of which is opposite to you in some ways. I love the deterioration of things as well, and what happens accidentally. We've got lots of animals around, so what happens, when a cow tramples through my sculpture? It's like, well, what happens? What does it look like? And I want to be capturing it on time lapse using cameras out in the country to see what happens.
Well,
so
I spend a lot of time studying degradation. So, and I've got an actually, as I've got older, I think more so as well, I've become more interested in things that degrade. And I quite like them and I love them. And I don't necessarily want to sweep it all away and renew it. Because actually much of the way, particularly I've worked on some Hepworth bronzes up in St Ives, and the way that some of the Hepworth bronzes have changed is so beautiful. There's a big balance and discussion about what you're doing, because obviously she had a particular vision for her sculptures, but actually I wouldn't bring myself to advise anyone to change the way that they've changed, because to me the fact that they're slightly haggard is fabulous, and you'd never get the patterns form that have actually formed naturally. So no, I think that it's a fascinating subject to see where things go to.
And I think nation is one of those things that it is a mystery.
Yeah.
How you get the colours initially, and then how they change. And sometimes you're nicely surprised, sometimes not so nicely
Sometimes
surprised.
horrified.
Yeah, I mean, I had one piece that I thought I was very proud of the patination. I really loved it. And then it was exhibited outdoors and ended up under a sort of leaky drain pipe.
Oh, no.
And actually, I loved what it turned into.
Oh, really?
It darkened rapidly and with little flecks of turquoise. So actually now look like it's carved from granite.
Absolutely. And you could never have created that in a million years. If you'd have tried, it would never have happened.
Yeah.
No, I think there's some masterful stuff in there. I remember going to see the over at Perry Green as well, the Henry Moore's, which just another magical place to go to, and noticing there was a sheep that had adopted one of the sculptures and had slept in it each night, and it was sort of like this fabulous alcove, and he slept in it. They said without fail he went to his bed at night and got in and curled up, and I mean this was thick with lanolin. I mean really thick, because obviously the amount of lanolin on the sheep's coat. So I mean you could literally peel it off, but he was so happy. Now to him, you know, Henry Moore had created that, and I mean it was huge as well, but had this little like perfect dip for him that fitted his little body perfectly. So I really hope you get a sheep or a kind of a squirrel or something that appreciates your sculptures.
But I think sort of with Henry Moore, I mean, he did those beautiful drawings of the sheep by his studios at Perry Green, didn't he? So he was really loved sheep. So I think it's really...
It wasn't particularly maybe a high-minded concept. It was just a sheep's bed that he was creating.
I don't think you would mind that.
Oh, thank you so much, Hazel, for taking the time to chat to me today. I've really enjoyed it.
Likewise, it's been a pleasure. You're such a fascinating life.
No, not at all. I'm just very lucky that I'm surrounded by sculpture all the time. That's just, you know, just where I want to be. So just tell me, where can people find you if they'd like to look at your work?
Probably my website, which is www.hazelreeves.com, and I'm on Twitter, Hazel Reeves, and Facebook as Hazel Reeves Sculptor. So you can find, and Instagram as well. Again, Hazel Reeves Sculptor. So you can find me. I'm out there, and it's great to be able to get some feedback and look at everybody else's inspiring ideas as well on social media.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Isn't Hazel incredible? I just loved her comment about how her life was her creative practice. In other words, the way she lives her life feeds that artistic spark inside her. She was actually very modest about that. She didn't make a big thing of it, but to have achieved that certainly isn't an easy thing, and she didn't get it handed to her. Her life wasn't going along that direction, and she had to make not just one decision to get herself there, but a series of specific choices to keep herself moving towards what she wanted. I think it must be almost harder when you've got a successful career in something to turn away from that. Everyone understands that you might do that when you're unhappy, you hate your job, but she was successful, and it would have been the easy road to have continued on with it and ignored the calling. So I really can't help admiring her, and I'm definitely including Emmeline holding forth on her kitchen chair in that sculpture park of my dreams. Next week, I'm going to be talking to Rodney Monday. I gave him some advice recently regarding the conservation of a new project that he's got in Cirencester, and his figurative sculpture in bronze is winning him commissions all over the UK, and it's really obvious why. He splits his life between Britain and France, and he'll be telling us a little bit about that too. I hope you found it interesting and inspiring today. Don't forget to take a look at the show notes where you'll find some of Hazel's photographs. If you're looking for a new book, please consider one of my novels about the dark side of the art world, where sculpture is always at the heart of the story. You can get them on the show website, on the usual online retailers, or even better, keep your local library alive, ask for them in there. Thank you for joining me today. Sculpture Vulture has been brought to you by Antique Bronze.